January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with 1,000 unseen mouths. Moisture clung to every leaf, every blade of kunai grass, every piece of rotting equipment half buried in the volcanic soil. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi stood at the edge of what remained of his command post, watching the last of his men, gaunt, hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging like burial shrouds, disappear into the tree line toward the evacuation beaches. The air smelled of cordite, decay, and something else he could not name. Defeat, perhaps, or revelation. In his leather satchel pressed against his chest lay a series of field reports he had compiled over 5 months of combat. Reports he knew would reshape everything the Imperial Japanese Army believed about their enemy. Reports written in blood and disbelief. The Americans they had been promised would crumble, these soft, individualistic products of jazz music and excessive comfort had instead become something the Japanese military doctrine had no framework to comprehend. They had not merely fought, they had endured, they had adapted, they had won. For decades, the architects of Japanese military expansion had constructed their worldview on a foundation of racial and cultural superiority. The soldier of the emperor, they believed, possessed Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, an intangible quality of discipline, sacrifice, and spiritual fortitude that no Western army could match. American forces, by contrast, were dismissed in staff colleges and strategy sessions as mechanized but weak, materially abundant but spiritually hollow. They would possess firepower, yes, but not will. Not the willingness to die that defined the samurai tradition, reborn in khaki and canvas. This assumption was not mere propaganda. It was doctrine. It was mathematics. Japanese war planners had studied American culture through the lens of contempt, a nation of immigrants with no unified spirit, a people made soft by democracy and material comfort, soldiers who valued their individual lives above the collective mission. The logic seemed sound. History, after all, had validated this worldview in Manchuria, in China, in the lightning conquests of the Philippines, Wake Island, and Singapore. Western colonial forces had collapsed like paper fortifications. The United States Marines were expected to be no different. Then came the first encounters on Guadalcanal, and the framework began to fracture. Colonel Akinosuke Oka, commanding the left wing of the August offensive, had led his men through 16 miles of mountainous jungle in tropical darkness, confident that the enemy would scatter before the fury of a properly executed night attack. The Marines were dug in along the Tenaru River, a thin defensive line that Japanese intelligence estimated to be poorly coordinated, likely disorganized after weeks of jungle conditions and limited supply. The attack began at 0310 hours. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry surged across the sandbar, bayonets fixed, voices raised in battle cries meant to shatter enemy morale. What they encountered instead was a wall of disciplined fire. Marines held their positions in interlocking fields of fire, their Browning machine guns methodically traversing predetermined sectors. There was no panic, no retreat, only sustained, devastating violence delivered with industrial precision. By dawn, over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the sand and in the shallow water. The Marines had lost 43 men. Oka survived. His report, later recovered from Japanese archives, contained a single line that would echo through subsequent military assessments. The enemy does not behave as intelligence predicted. What Japanese commanders had expected was an army of reluctant conscripts, men who joined for economic opportunity or because they had no other choice. What they encountered instead were volunteers who had chosen the hardest service their nation offered. The Marines did not see themselves as victims of conscription, but as members of an elite brotherhood. This was not merely motivational rhetoric, it was identity. Japanese officers observed with growing unease that captured Marine equipment manuals emphasized initiative at every level. Where Japanese doctrine demanded absolute obedience to orders, American Marine doctrine encouraged junior leaders to adapt, improvise, and make independent decisions when communication broke down. A Marine rifleman was expected to think. A squad leader was authorized to alter tactics based on terrain. This was not indiscipline, this was a different kind of discipline entirely, one rooted not in fear of dishonor, but in trust. Lieutenant Colonel Shoji, Chief of Staff for the 35th Infantry Brigade, wrote in his field diary, "Their sergeants fight like our captains, their privates maneuver like our squad leaders. This is not an army, this is a nation of soldiers." Then there was the matter of logistics, and here the symbolic weight of American abundance became impossible to ignore. A recurring image appears in Japanese accounts from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the ration tin. Small, cylindrical, olive drab, stamped with efficient lettering. Inside these tins, Japanese soldiers discovered not merely food but philosophy, canned fruit cocktail, chocolate bars, cigarettes branded Lucky Strike and Camel, meat that came preserved, ready to eat, dense with calories and flavor. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were reduced to eating grass, roots, and the bark of trees. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition killed more men than bullets. Supply convoys from Rabaul ran a gauntlet of American air and naval power, arriving sporadically, often empty. Officers began referring to Guadalcanal as Gato Starvation Island. Meanwhile, American forces expanded their positions with methodical confidence. Quonset huts rose from jungle clearings. Bulldozers carved roads. Field hospitals operated with surgical theaters and blood plasma, and the rations kept coming, mountains of them, more food in a week than a Japanese battalion might see in a month. Kawaguchi, in his post-evacuation report, devoted an entire section to this disparity. "The enemy's material strength is not merely a tactical advantage," he wrote. "It represents a fundamental difference in national will. They feed their soldiers as we feed our officers. This abundance is not accidental, it is intentional, it is strategic. It communicates a message: you are valued." The ration tin became more than sustenance. It became a symbol of the vast industrial machine behind every Marine on every island. For every man with a rifle, there were 10 ships, 100 factories, 1,000 workers. Japanese soldiers began to understand in the most visceral way possible that they were not fighting an army. They were fighting an economy. But material superiority alone does not explain what Japanese commanders encountered in the crucible of close combat. On Tarawa, in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio Island against some of the most fortified defenses in the Pacific. Japanese Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His garrison of elite special naval landing forces was entrenched in reinforced concrete bunkers interconnected by tunnels, protected by coral reefs and layers of barbed wire. The Marines came ashore into a hurricane of machine gun and artillery fire. Landing craft grounded on the reef hundreds of yards from the beach. Men waded through chest-deep water, weighed down by equipment, while Japanese gunners found their range. Bodies floated in the lagoon. The water turned red. And still they came. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as Marines, hit multiple times, continued advancing until they physically could not. Officers led from the front and died in the first minutes. Sergeants took command. When sergeants fell, corporals stepped forward. The attacks did not stop. The Marines did not retreat. They moved forward through fire with a ferocity that Japanese doctrine had no answer for, because it was not rooted in spiritual fatalism but in trained aggression and mutual accountability. Within 76 hours, Tarawa was secure. Of the 4,800 Japanese defenders, fewer than 24 survived. The Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties, but they had taken an island that was supposed to be impregnable. Colonel Tadao Katori, one of the few Japanese officers captured alive, was interrogated aboard an American hospital ship. His statement, recorded by Marine intelligence, revealed the psychological fracture. "We were told your men love life too much to die for victory. We were told wrong. Your Marines do not love death, but they do not fear it. This makes them more dangerous than men who seek death. They fight to win." As the island campaigns ground westward, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Japanese commanders attempted to adapt. New defensive doctrines emphasized fortified depth, tunnel networks, and attrition warfare. The goal shifted from immediate annihilation to making every yard so costly that American political will would break before Japanese spiritual resolve. It did not work. On Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, perhaps the most realistic of Japan's senior commanders, abandoned the suicidal banzai charges that had failed everywhere else. He constructed a fortress island, a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers designed to bleed the Americans white. 21,000 Japanese defenders, orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying. The Marines came in February 1945. They brought flamethrowers, demolition charges, tanks, and artillery. They brought coordinated combined arms tactics refined through 3 years of island warfare. And they brought something Kuribayashi had not fully accounted for. They brought each other. Marine units fought with a cohesion that transcended tactical doctrine. When one man fell, another moved into his place without hesitation. Corpsmen braved fire to retrieve wounded. Officers died alongside privates in bunker assaults. The bonds between these men were forged not by imperial decree, but by shared hardship and mutual respect. They fought for each other, and that made them nearly unstoppable. Kuribayashi's garrison fought with desperate courage. They inflicted 26,000 American casualties, including 6,800 dead, but in 36 days, Iwo Jima fell. Kuribayashi himself disappeared into the tunnels, presumably dead, leaving behind letters that acknowledged a terrible truth. The Americans have soldiers as brave as ours, but they also have everything else. By the spring of 1945, Japanese military leadership faced an enemy that had shattered every preconception. The Americans were not soft. They were not spiritually weak. They did not value material comfort above victory. They were, in fact, the product of a system that channeled individualism into collective power, that turned democratic values into military effectiveness, that married technological superiority with human tenacity. The ration tin appeared again, this time on Okinawa, scattered across captured positions. Japanese soldiers, starving and defeated, opened these tins and found inside them the final, undeniable lesson. Abundance was not a weakness. It was a weapon. The society that could feed its soldiers chocolate and fruit cocktail, while simultaneously producing thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, and limitless ammunition, was not decadent. It was powerful. And that power emerged not despite democracy, but because of it. American Marines fought fiercely, not because they were compelled by imperial mysticism, but because they had chosen their service, believed in their cause, and trusted their brothers. The Japanese military system demanded obedience unto death. The American system cultivated initiative, adaptability, and resilience. Both systems produced brave men. Only one produced victory. General Kawaguchi survived the war. In the decades after, he wrote extensively about the Pacific campaigns, his reflections marked by a melancholy honesty. He spoke of the young men he had led into jungles and coral fortresses, men who believed the propaganda, who died with courage in service of a strategic fantasy. "We were taught," he wrote, "that spirit conquers material that will defeat machinery, that the pure heart of Japan would triumph over Western decadence. We were wrong. The Americans possessed spirit and material. They had will and machinery, and their system, which we dismissed as chaotic individualism, produced a unity of purpose we could not match. They did not fight because they were told to. They fought because they chose to. That choice, rooted in freedom, made them invincible." The ration tin, that small cylindrical container of American abundance, sits today in museums across the Pacific, a mundane object, mass-produced and unremarkable. Yet within its stamped metal walls lay a truth that Imperial Japan learned too late. A nation that values its soldiers enough to feed them well, equip them properly and trust them completely is a nation that cannot be defeated by courage alone. The Marines who stormed those beaches carried more than rifles and grenades. They carried the weight of a free society that had chosen, collectively, to send its best into the fire and support them with everything it possessed. That was the lesson written in blood across 1,000 islands. That was what Japanese army leaders learned about US Marines. Not that Americans were unbeatable warriors descended from myth, but that free men, properly led, adequately supplied, and fighting for something they believe in, are the most formidable force human civilization can produce. And no amount of spirit alone could stand against that truth.